Your history teacher told you World War II started because of Adolf Hitler. An evil man seized power in Germany, built an army, and launched a war of conquest. The lesson ends there. Pack up your books, move to the next chapter. This version of history is comfortable. It places blame on a single villain. It requires no examination of the systems Western democracies built and defended. It demands no accountability from bankers, politicians, or economic architects who designed the machinery of catastrophe 2 decades before the first tank rolled into Poland. Hitler did not create the conditions for his rise. The Treaty of Versailles did. American bankers did. The gold standard did. Trade wars did. Oil embargoes did. A cascade of economic decisions made in London, Paris, New York, and Washington constructed a trap so complete that war became the rational choice for nations facing economic extinction. The price tag for World War II sits at an estimated $5 trillion in 1945 currency. The death toll reached 70 million human beings. These numbers exist because of economic architecture designed between 1919 and 1939. Every signature on the Treaty of Versailles, every loan issued by J.P. Morgan, every tariff raised by the United States Congress, every oil barrel denied to Japan. These decisions accumulated into the deadliest conflict in human history. The war had owners. It had creditors. It had balance sheets. Follow the money from the signing tables of Versailles to the beaches of Normandy, and you find a documented trail of extraction, leverage, and economic strangulation. You find nations choosing war because peace meant economic death. This is Rashi historical. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. The economic architecture of the 1930s now reassembles in front of your eyes. Trade wars between the United States and China, unprecedented sanctions against Russia, currency manipulation accusations, supply chain fragmentation, resource competition intensifying across Africa, the Middle East, and the South China Sea. The patterns match. The pressures build. The warnings from 1939 scream across 9 decades, and almost no one listens. Understanding how economics caused World War II is the first step toward recognizing the same machinery activating today. This is the documented story of the $1 trillion war. This is the hidden economy they never wanted you to trace. On June 28, 1919, German delegates signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. They signed under protest. They signed with Allied armies still mobilized. They signed knowing the terms amounted to economic execution. Article 231 assigned sole war guilt to Germany. This clause served a purpose beyond moral condemnation. It provided legal justification for reparations without limit or appeal. Germany had caused the war. Germany would pay for the war. The math did not need to work. The punishment did not need to be survivable. Justice demanded payment. The Reparations Commission announced its assessment in 1921, 132 billion gold marks. This figure translated to $33 billion at contemporary exchange rates. Adjusted for inflation, you face a demand exceeding $500 billion in present currency. Germany's entire GDP in 1919 stood at approximately 30 billion marks. The Allies demanded payment exceeding 4 years of total economic output. They demanded this from a nation stripped of 13% of its territory, 10% of its population, all its colonies, most of its merchant fleet, and critical industrial regions, including the Saar coalfields. The math invited failure. The structure guaranteed it. Germany had 3 options for payment. The first option, transfer gold reserves. Germany had limited gold. Transfers would drain reserves within months. The second option, transfer goods, manufactured products, coal, timber. But Germany needed to export these goods to generate the currency for reparations. The Allies simultaneously raised tariffs, blocking German exports. France did not want German steel competing with French steel. Britain did not want German textiles undercutting British factories. The third option, print currency. Create marks, buy foreign currency, pay reparations. This path led to hyperinflation. One man saw the trap with perfect clarity. John Maynard Keynes served as the British Treasury's representative at the Paris Peace Conference. He watched the economic provisions take shape. He calculated the impossibility. He resigned in protest and wrote his warning in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published within months of the signing. Keynes documented his predictions with precision. Germany lacked the capacity to pay. Attempts to extract payment would destroy the German economy. A destroyed German economy would destabilize all of Europe. Political extremism would fill the vacuum. The settlement planted seeds for a future war more terrible than the one it concluded. His book became a bestseller. Newspapers quoted his warnings. Politicians acknowledged his logic. They changed nothing. The machinery of extraction proceeded as designed. The reparation system contained a feature often missing from textbook accounts. Allied nations owed war debts to the United States totaling over $10 billion. Britain, France, Italy, and smaller allies had borrowed heavily from American banks to finance their war efforts. American Treasury records document these obligations with contractual precision. The circular flow operated as follows. American banks lent money to Germany. Germany used American loans to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used reparations receipts to service war debts owed to American banks. The money originated in New York, passed through Berlin, moved to Paris and London, and returned to New York. Germany added nothing to this cycle except its signature on loan documents and its commitment to future payment. This architecture created a chain of dependency with catastrophic potential. Remove American lending and the entire system collapsed. Germany defaulted on reparations. Allies defaulted on war debts. Banks holding these obligations faced crisis. Credit contracted. Economies fell. The Versailles system did not represent peace. It represented a mechanism for continuous extraction designed by creditors who needed their money back. Germany served as the pump. The question was never whether the pump would break. The question was when. By 1923, Germany had fallen behind on reparations payments. France responded with military force. In January, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. The occupation aimed to extract payment directly through control of coal and steel production. Germany responded with passive resistance. Workers refused to cooperate with occupying forces. The German government continued paying their wages despite the production stoppage. This required printing money on a scale never before attempted by an industrial nation. The pump broke. Hyperinflation arrived. In January 1921, one American dollar purchased 65 German marks. By January 1922, $1 purchased 191 marks. By January 1923, $1 purchased 17,172 marks. By November 1923, $1 purchased 4.2 trillion marks. You need to understand numbers beyond comprehension to grasp what happened. A loaf of bread in Berlin cost 163 marks in 1922. The same loaf cost 200 billion marks by November 1923. Workers received wages twice daily. They rushed to spend money during their lunch break because prices rose by the hour. A purchase, delayed by 30 minutes, meant a purchase no longer affordable. The Statistisches Reichsamt, Germany's statistical office, documented prices with bureaucratic precision throughout the collapse. Their records survive. The numbers tell a story of economic reality dissolving. Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer who witnessed the inflation, recorded its human toll. Savings accumulated over lifetimes vanished in weeks. A widow's pension purchased a month of groceries in 1921. By 1923, the same pension purchased a single postage stamp. The middle class watched their wealth evaporate. Mortgages became worthless. Insurance policies paid in currency lacking value to buy newspaper. Who benefited from this destruction? Those holding debt watched their obligations disappear. Industrialists who had borrowed to expand their factories repaid loans with worthless currency. Property owners kept their land while mortgage holders received paper. The industrial elite of Germany emerged from hyperinflation with their factories intact, their debts erased, their workforce desperate for any wage. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, bears documented responsibility. Internal deliberations from this period survive and archive. Some policymakers advocated inflation deliberately. They reasoned that demonstrating inability to pay would force reparations revision. The strategy succeeded in its narrow goal. The Dawes Plan of 1924 reduced immediate payment demands. The strategy failed in its broader consequences. It destroyed the economic security of millions. It bred a generation who learned to distrust currency, institutions, and democratic governance. The currency stabilization of late 1923 introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed by German land and industrial assets. Hjalmar Schacht, the new currency commissioner, enforced brutal monetary discipline. He stopped the printing presses, he restricted credit. The inflation ended almost overnight. The psychological damage persisted. Germans who lived through 1923 never forgot. When economic crisis returned a decade later, the memory of worthless currency and destroyed savings shaped their responses. The extremism of the 1930s grew in soil fertilized by the trauma of 1923. The Weimar Republic survived hyperinflation. It entered a period of apparent recovery, but the recovery rested on a foundation of foreign credit, and the creditors sat in New York. The next phase of catastrophe was loading. The Dawes Plan of 1924 redesigned German reparations. Named for American banker Charles Dawes, the plan reduced immediate payment burdens and established a schedule linked to German economic capacity. The plan contained a critical provision. American banks would provide loans to restart the German economy. J.P. Morgan and Company led the syndication of an initial 800 million mark loan. This opened the floodgates. Between 1924 and 1929, American investors poured $2.5 billion into German bonds. German states borrowed. German cities borrowed. German corporations borrowed. The money flowed freely because American investors sought higher yields than domestic markets offered. The structure of these loans contained embedded catastrophe. Approximately 70% of American lending to Germany carried short-term maturities, often less than 1 year. These loans could be recalled on demand. They could disappear overnight if American investors lost confidence. German economic statistics from 1924 to 1929 show impressive recovery. Industrial production surpassed 1913 levels. Unemployment fell, wages rose. New construction transformed German cities. The period earned the name Golden Twenties. The gold was borrowed. The circular flow operated throughout this period with mechanical precision. American banks lent to Germany. Germany paid reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain serviced war debts to American banks. Germany paid interest on American loans. Germany needed new loans to pay interest on old loans while maintaining reparations. The system required continuous expansion of credit to function. Benjamin Strong, governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, understood the danger. His correspondence from 1927 survives in Federal Reserve archives. "We have been putting up money in Europe," he wrote, "and we are apt to have a day of reckoning." Strong maintained low interest rates partly to support European borrowing. His death in 1928 removed a key architect of international monetary cooperation. The Federal Reserve shifted toward tighter domestic policy without regard for European consequences. The prosperity of the 1920s extended beyond Germany. American credit fueled growth across Europe. It financed reconstruction. It supported currencies returning to gold standard valuations. It created the appearance of stability across a continent still bleeding from war. American domestic markets absorbed even more credit during this period. Stock market speculation reached unprecedented levels. Brokers extended margin loans, allowing investors to purchase stocks with 10% down payments. The speculation fed on itself. Rising prices justified more borrowing. More borrowing pushed prices higher. The Federal Reserve faced a dilemma by 1928. Raise interest rates to cool speculation and cut off European credit. Maintain low rates to support Europe and fuel domestic speculation. They chose to raise rates in 1928 and accelerated the increases in 1929. Higher American interest rates pulled capital home. Why accept 6% from a German municipal bond when American markets offered higher returns with lower risk? The flow reversed. Credit contracted across Europe. Germany faced the margin call on its borrowed prosperity. The October 1929 crash marked the beginning, but not the cause. American lending to Europe had already contracted months before the market collapsed. The stock crash accelerated withdrawal. Banks needed liquidity. They called foreign loans. They refused new lending. The machinery of international credit seized. The Great Depression did not begin everywhere at once. It spread through documented channels of credit withdrawal, bank failure, and trade collapse. Understanding the transmission mechanism reveals how American banking decisions determined European political futures. American new lending to Europe fell from $1.25 billion annually in the mid-1920s to near zero by 1930. Existing short-term loans came due. German borrowers faced demands for repayment without access to refinancing. The first major bank failure occurred in Austria. Kreditanstalt, the largest bank in Central Europe, collapsed in May 1931. The bank had extended loans across the former Habsburg territories. Those loans turned bad as debtors failed. The Austrian government lacked resources for adequate bailout. Kreditanstalt's failure sent shockwaves through European banking. German banks held extensive ties to Austria. Panic spread northward within weeks. In July 1931, Danet Bank, one of Germany's largest commercial banks, failed. Runs spread to other institutions. The German government declared a bank holiday, freezing withdrawals and transfers. German businesses lost access to operating capital. Payrolls went unmet. Production stopped. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning implemented emergency austerity measures. He raised taxes, cut government spending, and reduced wages by decree. These policies aimed to demonstrate fiscal responsibility to international creditors. They deepened the Depression instead. Reduced government spending meant reduced demand. Reduced wages meant reduced consumption. The deflationary spiral intensified. German unemployment reached 6 million workers by early 1932. This represented 1/3 of the industrial workforce. Millions more worked reduced hours at reduced pay. The social insurance system, designed for normal unemployment levels, collapsed under the load. Bread lines formed. Soup kitchens opened. Families lost homes. President Herbert Hoover proposed a moratorium on war debts and reparations in June 1931. The Hoover moratorium suspended payments for 1 year. It came too late. Credit had already contracted. Banks had already failed. The pause in debt payments did not restart lending. The gold standard amplified every negative shock. Countries committed to gold convertibility had to maintain reserve ratios. When gold flowed out, money supplies contracted. Credit tightened regardless of domestic conditions. Britain abandoned the gold standard in September 1931, allowing the pound to float. The immediate devaluation improved British competitiveness, but devastated countries still tied to gold. The United States remained on gold until 1933, importing deflation and unemployment through the exchange rate mechanism. France remained on gold until 1936, suffering prolonged depression as a result. The gold standard, presented as guarantor of stability, became machinery of economic destruction. World trade statistics document the catastrophe with cold precision. Global trade volume stood at $36 billion in 1929. By 1932, it had collapsed to $12 billion, a 66% contraction in 3 years. Every country sought to export its unemployment by restricting imports and promoting exports. Every country simultaneously raised barriers. The result was universal contraction. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, signed by President Hoover in June 1930, raised American import duties to historically unprecedented levels. Over 1,000 American economists signed a petition warning of consequences. The warnings were ignored. Trading partners retaliated with their own tariffs. The spiral of protection accelerated global trade collapse. German political consequences unfolded with statistical precision. Historians have correlated unemployment rates with Nazi Party vote share across electoral districts and over time. The correlation coefficient reaches 0.95. This stands as one of the strongest statistical relationships in political science. Economic desperation translated directly into political extremism. The Nazi Party received 2.6% of the vote in 1928 during borrowed prosperity. They received 18.3% in September 1930 as depression deepened. They received 37.3% in July 1932 at the depression's nadir. Hitler became chancellor in January 1933. The economic conditions created by credit withdrawal, bank failure, and trade collapse placed him in power. Industrial funding for the Nazi Party accelerated during the Depression years. Records from the period document contributions from steel magnates, coal barons, and banking interests. These donors sought protection from communism, suppression of labor unions, and rearmament contracts. They purchased political outcomes through campaign contributions. They got their war. By 1933, the international economic order had fragmented. The gold standard lay in ruins. Trade had collapsed. Nations pursued survival through competitive measures that guaranteed collective destruction. The currency wars and trade bloc formation of the 1930s created the economic conditions making war appear rational. Britain's departure from gold in September 1931 triggered the first wave of competitive devaluation. The pound fell 30% against gold-linked currencies. British exports became cheaper overnight. Countries still on gold faced immediate competitive disadvantage. The United States devalued in 1933 and 1934. Franklin Roosevelt raised the dollar price of gold from $20.67 to $35 more per ounce. This represented a 40% dollar devaluation. The devaluation aimed to raise domestic prices and stimulate recovery. It succeeded domestically while exporting deflation to trading partners. France led a gold bloc of nations committed to maintaining gold convertibility. Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Italy, and Poland joined. These countries suffered prolonged depression as their currencies became overvalued relative to devaluing competitors. They faced impossible choices. Maintain gold and suffer, devalue and admit defeat. One by one, they chose devaluation. The gold bloc collapsed by 1936. Currency instability made international trade a gamble. An exporter agreeing to a price in foreign currency faced unpredictable returns when payment arrived months later and exchange rates had shifted. Businesses reduced foreign exposure. Trade contracted further. Nations responded with trade bloc formation. The British Empire adopted imperial preference at the Ottawa Conference of 1932. Member nations lowered tariffs against each other while maintaining barriers against outsiders. The sterling bloc encompassed Britain, its colonies, dominions, and nations, linking their currencies to the pound. France constructed a similar bloc around its currency and colonies. The United States promoted a dollar zone across the Americas. Each bloc represented a sphere of protected trade, exclusive arrangements, and coordinated policy. Germany, stripped of colonies by Versailles and excluded from major currency blocs, developed an alternative system. Hjalmar Schacht, now serving as Hitler's economics minister, created bilateral clearing agreements. Germany would trade with partners on a barter basis, exchanging manufactured goods for raw materials without convertible currency changing hands. By 1936, Germany had signed clearing agreements with nations across Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Balkans. These agreements gave Germany access to food and resources. They gave partner nations access to German industrial products. They bypassed the dollar and pound entirely. The Schachtian system created a German-centered trade network. Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria became economic satellites. They supplied wheat, oil, minerals, and timber. They received German machinery, chemicals, and weapons. The economic integration preceded political domination. Autarky emerged as national policy across the revisionist powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan concluded that dependence on international trade meant vulnerability to blockade and sanction. Each nation pursued self-sufficiency programs of varying ambition and success. Germany's four-year plan, announced in 1936, aimed to prepare the economy for war within 4 years. Hermann Goering led the effort. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate, developed synthetic fuel production from coal. Synthetic rubber production expanded. Domestic iron ore extraction increased despite higher costs than imports. The program sacrificed efficiency for security. The costs proved enormous. Synthetic fuel cost 4 times more than imported petroleum. Domestic iron ore contained less iron than Swedish imports. The inefficiencies accumulated. German living standards stagnated while military production expanded. The economy could not sustain both guns and butter indefinitely. The 4-year plan contained an implicit deadline. War needed to come before the economic contradictions exploded. Schacht himself warned against the pace of rearmament. He resigned as economics minister in 1937, citing unsustainable military spending. His successor proved more compliant. The rearmament continued. Hidden financing through MIFO bills, a form of off-budget credit, accumulated obligations that only conquest could resolve. Germany was arming itself into a debt trap that only war could break. Japan faced even more acute resource constraints. The Japanese home islands lacked petroleum, iron ore, rubber, and most industrial raw materials. Japan imported 80% of its oil from American sources. It depended on American scrap metal for steel production. These dependencies placed Japanese military capacity at the mercy of American trade policy. Japanese strategic planners developed the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere as their answer to resource vulnerability. Southeast Asia contained oil in the Dutch East Indies, rubber in Malaya, rice in Indochina. A southward advance would secure resources and end dependence on potentially hostile suppliers. The calculation was cold and documented. Japanese military archives contain resource assessments, production estimates, and strategic timelines. The planners understood that war with Western powers was probable. They calculated that resource acquisition would offset the risks. They were wrong about outcomes, but rational about incentives. Italy pursued colonial expansion for similar reasons. Ethiopia fell to Italian invasion in 1935 and 1936. The conquest aimed to secure raw materials and agricultural land. League of Nations sanctions in response demonstrated the limits of international enforcement. The sanctions hurt Italian consumers but failed to stop the war. Italy completed its conquest. The lesson learned. Aggression worked when the international community lacked resolve. The final 5 years before World War II saw economic warfare escalate to the point where shooting war became its natural continuation. Sanctions, embargoes, asset freezes, and trade restrictions created conditions where nations calculated that military action offered better odds than continued economic strangulation. Germany's position by 1939 presented a documented dilemma. The rearmament program had consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. Foreign exchange reserves had dwindled, gold stocks had fallen, consumer goods shortages generated domestic discontent. The MEFO bills would come due. The economy required either conquest or collapse. Hitler's own statements from this period make the economic logic explicit. In meetings with military commanders documented in German archives, he outlined the necessity of territorial expansion to secure resources. The conquest of Eastern Europe would provide agricultural land, oil from Romania, and forced labor for German industry. Autarky through empire would replace autarky through synthetic production. The August 1939 pact with the Soviet Union solved an immediate problem. Germany secured access to Soviet raw materials in exchange for manufactured goods. The Molotov-Ribbentrop trade agreements provided oil, grain, and minerals that Germany lacked. They also ensured that the attack on Poland would not face a two-front war. The invasion of Poland triggered British and French declarations of war. The Western powers calculated that German expansion threatened their own imperial interests. If Germany dominated continental Europe, it would control resources and markets rivaling British and French empires. The balance of power demanded resistance. France fell in 6 weeks during May and June 1940. The fall of France transferred French industrial capacity to German control. Continental Europe now formed a German-centered economic bloc by force of arms rather than treaty. Britain stood alone, blockaded but undefeated, dependent on American supplies crossing submarine-infested Atlantic waters. The June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union followed economic logic documented in German planning materials. Ukraine's grain and Caucasian oil would fuel German military power indefinitely. Soviet industrial resources would replace depleted German stocks. The Lebensraum ideology provided justification, but resource acquisition provided motivation. The Pacific War originated even more clearly in economic causation. Japan's expansion into China from 1937 onward produced increasing American disapproval. The United States responded with graduated economic pressure. Export controls on aviation fuel came in July 1940. Scrap metal exports ended in September 1940. The final escalation came in July 1941. On July 26, 1941, President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States. This action, combined with Dutch and British parallel measures, cut off 90% of Japanese oil imports. Japanese strategic petroleum reserves would last approximately 18 months. The Navy would run dry within 2 years. Japanese planning documents from this period survive in military archives. They show calculations of agonizing clarity, accept American demands to withdraw from China and lose imperial status, attempt to negotiate while reserves depleted and bargaining position weakened, or strike southward, seize oil in the Dutch East Indies, and establish a defensive perimeter before American industrial power could mobilize. The attack on Pearl Harbor came 131 days after the oil embargo. The Japanese Navy calculated that it needed to destroy American Pacific Fleet to protect the southern resource zone. The timing reflected oil reserve depletion rates. The strategic decision reflected economic desperation. American planning documents from the same period show awareness of these dynamics. The oil embargo aimed to pressure Japanese withdrawal from China. American planners understood the risk of provoking war. They underestimated Japanese willingness to accept that risk. The embargo was economic warfare. Pearl Harbor was its kinetic continuation. The entry of the United States transformed the war into a resource competition that Axis powers could not win. American industrial capacity exceeded Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American access to global raw materials remained unrestricted. The war's outcome was determined by economic factors before a single American soldier reached European or Pacific battlefields. The economic analysis extends to all belligerents. Britain fought to preserve an empire whose resources underwrote British power. The Soviet Union fought for survival, but also for industrial resources in Eastern Europe. China resisted Japanese extraction of labor and resources. Each combatant entered and sustained the war for economic reasons, intertwined with ideology and survival. Contemporary warning. The economic architecture producing World War II now reconstructs across the global system. The patterns match with disturbing precision. Trade war between the United States and China echoes Smoot-Hawley. Sanctions against Russia exceed any economic warfare since the 1940s. Currency manipulation accusations fly between Washington and Beijing. Supply chains fragment along geopolitical lines. Nations pursue resource security through territorial assertion. China's position mirrors Japan's in the 1930s with uncomfortable precision. China imports over 70% of its oil, with supply lines crossing choke points subject to American naval interdiction. China depends on semiconductor imports for its technology sector. Chinese strategists write openly about the Taiwan question in resource security terms. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company produces over 90% of advanced chips. Control of Taiwan means control of the computing future. Russian economic planners studied the 1930s sanctions experience before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. They built foreign exchange reserves. They reduced dollar dependence. They established alternative payment systems. They calculated that Western sanctions would hurt but not collapse the Russian economy. Their calculations proved partially correct. The war continues. The sanctions adapt. The escalation spiral tightens. American tariff policy since 2018 has reconstructed barriers not seen since the 1930s. Tariffs on Chinese goods reached 25% across broad categories. Chinese retaliation followed. European tariffs mounted. The World Trade Organization lost enforcement capacity. The rules-based trading order phrase. Friendshoring and reshoring represent the 2020s version of trade bloc formation. The United States pulls supply chains to allied nations. China develops domestic capacity and alternative partners. Two economic spheres form with decreasing overlap. The fragmentation continues. Sanctions have become the primary tool of economic warfare. Asset freezes, payment system exclusions, technology embargoes, secondary sanctions on third parties. The Russian asset freeze exceeding $300 billion has no precedent. Other nations observe. They draw conclusions about dollar dependence and Western legal vulnerability. They diversify. The dollar's reserve status erodes at the margins. The history of the 1930s offers a documented warning. Economic warfare escalated to the point where military warfare appeared the better option. Sanctions did not prevent aggression. Embargoes accelerated it. Trade bloc formation created the conditions for shooting war between blocs. This does not mean war is inevitable. The 1930s differed in crucial respects. Nuclear weapons changed the cost calculation. Economic interdependence runs deeper than in the 1930s. International institutions, weakened as they are, still exist. The warning is simpler and more urgent. Economic decisions carry military consequences. Trade policy is security policy. Sanctions are warfare by other means. The decision-makers imposing economic measures must calculate responses beyond the immediate. They must ask what options they leave to their targets. They must remember Japan after July 1941. The trillion-dollar war grew from economic seeds planted in 1919 and watered through the 1920s and 1930s. Every reparations demand, every loan extended, every tariff raised, every currency devalued, every embargo imposed. These decisions accumulated until war appeared rational to nations facing economic strangulation. You live in a period when similar decisions accumulate. You vote for politicians who make these decisions. You hold currency and assets affected by these decisions. You will send your children to fight wars growing from these decisions. Understanding the economic causes of World War II is the first step toward recognizing the same machinery activating in your lifetime. History does not repeat, but it instructs. The instruction from 1939 is clear. Economic warfare creates shooting wars. The only question is when the calculation tips. The cost of that calculation in the 1940s was $5 trillion and 70 million dead. The cost in the 2040s would be measured in figures no human mind can grasp. The money trail runs from Versailles to Pearl Harbor. It runs from the Treaty of Versailles to your morning news. Follow it, understand it. Demand that your leaders understand it before they impose the next round of sanctions, raise the next tariff, or tighten the next embargo. The $1 trillion war has lessons for the $1 trillion peace. The question is whether anyone learns them in time.